Hi, I'm Peter Mayrick from Partners in Ministry. Thank you so much for joining us today in the next in our series on church leadership, our webinar series. I'm excited for today because today we're addressing a topic that has a profound influence on Christian ministers and Christian leaders. The topic is avoiding burnout and building resilience and longevity. We're going to talk about this topic, a serious topic. As we do, though, we'd love you to interact. So if you'd like to put a question, please click on the question and we'll seek our best to answer it. There will be some questions, though, that might require a little bit more detail or might be better done privately. Feel free to send those to our email address, which we'll give you in a moment later on. But today we're talking about burnout and resilience in ministry. You and I both know this is an enormous topic. Leading a church is an isolated role. It can be a role where it's very difficult to be vulnerable. And we see about 25% of ministers dealing with real burnout as they go on. And we want to see longevity. Partners in Ministry exists to help leaders to flourish. And so this topic is very important to us. We walk beside church leaders, that's what we do, and we want to help people to move forward. And today, we hope that what we'll bring to the table is some ideas and some strategies to deal with this very important topic. What we're going to do is we're going to cover 4 phases today. The first phase is my colleague Mark Connor, who has been a pastor for many years, led a very large church in Victoria, and is one of our ministry partners working beside our ministers. He's going to talk about burnout in general from a personal perspective to tell us a little bit about his story. Secondly, my colleague Kirsty Bucknell. Kirsty, we're so glad to have you here. Kirsty is an organisational psychologist and she has done a PhD looking directly at resilience in ministry. So this is a sweet spot for you, Kirsty. And we're really looking forward to hearing what you have today. Chapter 3, we're then going to talk about the strategies and we're going to interact around those strategies. And then section 4, we'd love to hear your questions and we'll deal with that in a discussion. So let's kick it off. And let me introduce Mark Connor. Mark, we'd love to hear, why don't you tell us a little bit about your story and how burnout fits into that?
Thanks, Peter. Real privilege for me to be a part of today's webinar. As you mentioned, such an important topic for anyone in leadership, but particularly those in the church world. One of those people that don't believe church leaders necessarily work harder than others, but there are some really unique pressures from the church environment. So, yeah, great to be able to share my story as part of today's webinar as we kick off the topic. Back in my early 40s, I had what I call an emotional valley that lasted probably for about 6 months. And I wasn't sure what was going on, but it kind of took everything within me just to get through the next meeting, the next appointment, the next project. In fact, my mood was high when something was done rather than leading up to it or during the event or experience. And I felt overwhelmed a lot of the time, which is very unusual for me. I have a pretty high capacity, and I didn't have the energy to think much beyond what was right in front of me. And so this emotional valley was subtle but very debilitating. And I was really confused. I wasn't sure what was happening. Was this a wilderness experience? Was God kind of testing my faith, developing character? Was this a spiritual attack? We all know there's a spiritual warfare dimension to ministry. So, is this the enemy having a go at me? I need to kind of withstand, or is this a midlife crisis? As I mentioned, I'd recently turned 40, and so I really wasn't sure what was going on. What was unusual is everything on the outside was going pretty well. I was healthy, family was good, friendships were good, church was going well. So there was no external trigger for me that would help me understand why I was in this emotional valley, but something was clearly wrong. With the help of a personal coach, I came to realize that I'd been living at an unsustainable pace, and I was actually experiencing something called adrenaline exhaustion. I'd go on a mission trip with a team to India for a couple of weeks. We'd be handing out sewing machines in the day to widows, doing big rallies and events at night. I'd come back on a Friday, I'd preach 4 or 5 times on the weekend, and then I'd jump on a plane on Monday, head to America. I was passionate for the work of God in our world. But I'd been living at this unsustainable pace. And so I was experiencing adrenaline exhaustion. And as a result, my emotions were simply shutting down, refusing to live at this crazy speed. And they only seemed to provide me enough energy for what was directly in front of me. And I had very little over, and I wasn't able to get excited about much beyond today. And so it took time to come out of this valley. There was no instant fix. So I couldn't just snap out of it. I had to slow down. I had to take some more time off. I had to rest a little bit more. Had to lower my high expectations, particularly when it came to productivity of what I could get done in a certain day. I shared openly with my family and friends and some close team members, and they were incredible support during this time. And gradually I came up out of this valley. I now recognize when I'm nearing this valley, I haven't been back there again, but similar to when you go over the edge of a road when you're driving a car, you know the danger signs, you know the signals. And as the years have gone on, I've learned to pay attention to some of the signals that would warn me that I'm in a vulnerable place. And one of those key indicators for me is if my highest emotion is when something is done, a task, a meeting, or event, rather than when I'm leading up to it or engaged in it, then I know I'm in a vulnerable place. I know my tank is running a little bit empty. After that time, I benefited greatly from an external mentor, Keith Farmer. Many of you may have heard of Keith. And I used to meet with him on a regular basis. And one of the questions he'd ask me is, how's your emotional tank from 1 to 10? And so I had someone who I was able to say, well, it's about a 6 this month, or it's a 4, or it's a 7. And so just monitoring my emotional well-being really was a great lesson from that first experience for me of adrenaline exhaustion. Quite a few years later, back in 2016, I had another experience with a form of burnout. It was a little bit different this time, and I don't think I was really aware of it at the time. Looking back, I think this was the result of the cumulative wear and tear of being on church staff for 32 years, 22 of those as a senior minister. I was the third minister at what is now City Life Church in Melbourne. And we'd seen some incredible growth over those 22 years, from a church of about 1,500 people to around 10,000, meeting in 5 locations, 11 weekend services. And so as the church had grown, the workload had grown, the complexity had grown. It was a large organisation, not just a church, but we had a big community ministry, a Christian school with 2,000 students in 2 locations, missions ministry active in 15 nations. And again, there were lots of leaders and people helping, but all of that resulted in me kind of spending 2/3 of my time in meetings, and just the cumulative wear and tear of leading in that space. In addition, the growth of the church has slowed a little bit as we've spread out. My wife, Nicole, was involved for 15 years on our senior leadership team, and then she felt to go to the not-for-profit space, so I missed her being around. And so all of these things kind of worked together, and my hope for the future, my drive, my motivation levels were at an all-time low. And as I look back now, I realized I was no longer really enjoying my job. In fact, during this time, Nicole asked me, if you didn't have your job today, would you apply for it? It's a pretty good question. And at that stage, I had to say, no, I don't think I would apply for this. And so in this case, it ended up leading to a change, and began speaking openly with our leadership team and board, and ended up resigning in February 2016. I finished up in that role, passed the baton to a new leader, and took quite a few months off, and then began a new season of life in ministry, and started picking up some energizing activities without that degree of burden and pressure and responsibility that I carried for so long. And within 1 year, I was experiencing new amounts of joy and peace and well-being. I just felt totally different. I felt so much better. I'm not suggesting you finish up in your role, but I'm just using this as an example of burnout and stress and pressure. There's a book by Henry Cloud that I found helpful called Necessary Endings. And in life, there are some necessary endings. They're hard, and they always involve grief and loss, but they make way for new beginnings. And I remember when I was deliberating about what to do, I remember praying one morning and just saying to God, would you be okay if I finished up? I didn't hear an audible voice, but I just sensed this smile. for me, my calling had become a sense of obligation. And I think I just kept doing what I was doing, even though I wasn't enjoying it, because I felt called. I now realize that our calling is not to one particular role or assignment, but it's to a contribution. And so that was one expression of my calling. But now, 5 or 6 years on, I'm able to coach and mentor pastors. I'm able to be involved in many different churches and spaces that I couldn't have done in that role. And so that was my second experience with, as I look back now, I realized I was nearing burnout just because of the cumulative wear and tear of ministry. Christian psychologist Arch Hart notes that there's a difference between burnout, stress, and depression. Burnout is more emotional, while stress is more physical in its symptoms. And burnout particularly includes a sense of helplessness or hopelessness, a loss of motivation and drive, and a little bit of lethargy. And I was definitely experiencing that during that season. I'll just finish this part of our webinar just with a Bible verse that I found very helpful, Matthew 11, 28 to 30. In the Message Bible, Jesus says, "Are you tired, worn out, burnt out on religion? Come to me, get away with me, and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me, work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me and you'll learn to live freely and lightly." I love that. In the other translations, Jesus says, "My burden is easy and light." There is a burden when you're a leader, when you're involved in the church world. There is a burden, but it's not meant to destroy you. And if it's not easy and light, if it's actually destroying you, then you've got to really think about the way you're going about ministry. I love that phrase, learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I'm sure we'll be able to talk about some of the principles for avoiding burnout and developing a resilience in whatever ministry role you might find yourself today. Yeah, so Peter, that's a little bit of my story, two kind of different experiences around adrenal exhaustion and feelings of burnout, and I hope that they may be helpful for some of those that have joined us today.
Thank you so much, Mark. I really appreciate hearing your story, and I'm sure there are people watching this who are saying, yeah, I relate to that. Whether it be the exhaustion, whether it be the frustration, whether it be the sense of lack of enjoyment. Thanks for being so vulnerable, and thanks for the encouragement with Matthew 11. Love it. It's fantastic. But this is such a serious topic, isn't it? What Mark just described is common to about 25% of church leaders. It is so common, and we want to help pastors to get through this. And Kirsty, you heard what Mark said. You've been working in this space and researching in this space. What do we know about this topic?
Well, you'd be surprised. We actually know a whole lot more than we used to.
Good.
Which is great. So we know quite a lot about burnout, and we're growing in our understanding of resilience as well. So you've mentioned the statistic of about a quarter of our people, of Protestant Christian leaders, suffer from burnout. There was a study, that study was done in 2001. Yeah. And that study that was done by Bullpit and Caldor, they found that not only was a quarter of the Christian leaders suffering from burnout, there was another 56% of people that were approaching burnout or were candidates for burnout as well. So what we're seeing is this huge prevalence of people who are in ministry and who are either suffering from burnout or approaching that. So it's a really important topic for us to address today, and to think about, okay, what can we do to support people who are in ministry? So as Mark has already shared, there are really quite a unique set of stressors that people in ministry face. And you talked, Mark, about unique pressures. And in my work, I'm thinking about 3 or 4 key areas of stress, stressors that we see in ministry. The first one is the workload. And you think about workload in terms of the complexity and just the range of tasks, the ambiguity that exists within ministry, and the types of work that people who are in ministry are engaging in. Yeah. So there's a real range of complexity there. The second part about workload is the emotional load that people who are in ministry carry. So there's a range of topics that people end up engaging in from a vicarious perspective as well. So there's stressors that people engage in, whether or not they're supporting people through bereavement, whether or not they're issues of domestic violence, mental health. There are a lot of topics that, as we support people in ministry workers are really faced with this vicarious emotional load of supporting other people. So workload is a really big topic and a big area where people who are in ministry are faced with stressors in their workload. But secondly, there's a topic of conflict, and this topic relates to tension and criticism that comes to people who are in ministry. And the tension and criticism comes from people who are in the ministry, so in ministry teams, that's a big area of tension, but also people who are over the ministry and people who are beyond the ministry as well. So I don't want to make everybody feel too heavily burdened, but that's a topic of area. So we've got workload, we've got this issue of conflict, and then finally we've got issues around personal and family life. So these cover off the things that we all face in life in terms of just getting on and living our lives. But there's this extra dimension that comes in this ministry role that brings in the complexities of intrusion, of role blurring and the boundaries blurring. We also have issues around isolation as well. And so what's the relationship between people who are in my ministry, and are they friends, are they not? Like, how do I think about this element of relationship and how I fit, and what's that fit for me? So they're the 3 or 4 key areas that I like to think about in terms of what is a stressor in ministry. So we know we've got all of these people who are approaching ministry burnout. How does what we see in ministry compare to other helping professions? And it's a really helpful study that was done recently, 2017. It was a US-based study that looked at 84 other studies of burnout, and it compared clergy with social workers, counsellors and teachers for their similarity in terms of the emotional load, and also compared them to police and emergency workers because of the high stress arousal and the similarity in those roles. And what they found was that clergy members were experiencing moderate levels of burnout compared to these other groups.
Wow.
Yeah. But what we saw was that clergy were doing better, so less burnout, than people who are in the police and in emergency personnel. So at that high stress arousal. They were about the same as social workers and teachers, but they were doing worse than counsellors. Okay. So just in terms of thinking about, we appreciate that there are these high levels of burnout in ministry, but how does that compare to other people who are in our environment, in our communities as well? So we're getting a bit of a sense of the need to really focus on supporting and preventing burnout in ministry as well. So what do we know about resilience in ministry? Because we don't want to just focus on the stressors, on the hard parts of it. We need to think about what can we do to support people, and there is a lot that we're learning and that we can grow in here.
Great, we're listening.
Hooray! So in 2014, 2015, Grant Pickerton has done some great work. He and his co-authors published some great work there. He was looking at highlighting the need for us to balance the demands of ministry, so all of those stressors, with the resources that we have available to us. And he also stressed that we want to match the type of demand with the type of resource.
Gotcha.
Yeah? So in ministry, we're faced with spiritual demands, relational, organisational demands. We want to make sure that we're building up resources in the same area. So we want to build up spiritual resources. We want to build up relational resources. We want to build up our organisational, practical resources as well. So we want to get this balance right. And so when Mark's talking about filling up our emotional tank, we want to be thinking about, actually, there are a couple of different valves in our tanks. How many different tanks have we got? And so we want to be thinking about, in my book I have 6 tanks, so we want to think about the spiritual, the emotional, we want to think about physical, organisational, mental, and I've missed one, social, I think.
I think you did that well.
Yeah. So we want to be thinking about all the demands that we're faced with, but then also what are we doing to build resources in those areas. So that's been really helpful work that Grant has done for us. The work that I've been doing has been to think a little bit more about resilience and what we can do to build on that. So the resources, as we're thinking about resources, and there's different types of resources that we have, they're really supportive and helpful for our well-being. But we want to think a little bit more broadly around resilience. So when we think about well-being and the definition of well-being, we're thinking about positive mental functioning. Okay, and that's constant. When we're thinking about resilience, we're thinking about positive mental function in the presence of a stressor. Okay, so that might be the sort of bounce back resilience that we you often hear about. So where you're going along, you experience some kind of stressor, there's a slight dip, and then you're able to recover, and your mental function continues on. So there's that bounce back resilience, but we also have a robust resilience as well, where you might be tracking along, you hit a stressor, and actually you're so well experienced, you're so good at dealing with that particular stressor that you just continue on through it. So that's robust resilience.
Gotcha.
And so different types.
So it's not avoiding the stressor, it's dealing with the stressor.
And having the sorts of strategies that you require, the sorts of resources available to you to be able to deal with that stressor.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, and both are good. Both are good.
Yeah.
So to be resilient, we want to think about not just our resources, but we want to think about all of our resilient capacities. So on top of the resources that are available to us to support our well-being, we want to think about how do we deal with that specific stressor as well. So on top of resources, the work that I've been doing has added thinking about our coping and emotional regulatory strategies that we use in the face of a stressor, and then also thinking about the beliefs that we have, our beliefs around how well we cope, and what our beliefs are about our world, about ourselves, about our God, and how that factors into our ability to deal with stressors in our ministries as well. Yeah, there's a lot there. So in my work we can see that there's, the work I've been doing has been to test some resilience training, where we get people to reflect on their experiences and to reflect on those stressors. And what we're finding is that as we guide people through that reflection, and particularly positively oriented reflection, that we're finding that people who are in ministry can grow from those stresses, from those experiences, and they can develop in their resilience and their positive mental function as well.
And so it makes them better on this, not just a bounce back resilience, but just dealing with and coping resilience.
Yeah, well, we haven't done specific studies as yet, but it's looking like it's supportive of both types. Yeah. So I think most of us would agree that just an exposure to the stressors of ministry doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to develop resilience, but what we're trying to do is to help people to reflect on their stressors, on their experiences, and by reflecting on those stressors, they grow insight into both themselves but also their environment, and then from there they grow and learn to use appropriate strategies, draw on resources that they think are really helpful, and live out the sort of lives that they want to live out as well. Yeah.
I know we'll get to this, but I'm assuming that's different for different people.
Absolutely, yeah. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach, because we all respond to different stressors in different ways. Yes. So the one situation I might not find that stressful at all, whereas you might. In another situation that might be reversed.
Gotcha.
But then also the resources that we have on hand might differ. The sorts of strategies that I've learnt over my course of ministry might be different to the sorts of strategies that you've learnt. The different beliefs that we hold will be different.
Yeah.
So this process of reflecting in order to gain insight helps us to understand ourselves and how we interact in our ministries, how God's at work in us there.
Reflection that leads to insight. Now, this is what I've heard from you a number of times. I love this statement, by the way, because the reflection on its own, you taught me this, is not enough. And then you told me, actually, it can't just be reflection that leads to insight. Now you move to reflection that leads to positive insight. But what do you mean by that?
Well, so it's not necessarily positive insight, but it's positively oriented reflection.
Yes.
So what we're finding, or my most recent work is showing that as we think about stressors that we've handled well, that we actually find that we can grow in resilience at that point, because it helps to improve. What we're proposing, hypothesising, is that as we reflect on situations that we've handled well, we can see what works for us, so we can keep using those sorts of strategies, but also gives us a greater sense of efficacy of actually, I can do this. And yeah, Mark's talking about his calling. I can see that this is where God has called me to be. Oftentimes, I think we just tend to reflect on where we've gone poorly, because that's the time when we think, oh, okay, I've really stuffed this up. I want to, I spend time thinking about it. But I think when we spend time actively thinking about where we've gone well, we can actually grow from that experience as well.
And that sort of reflection you call rumination, which is I suck, I stuffed up. That's not good, is it?
Yeah, look, we don't want people to get into rumination, and so that's why participating in a structured reflective activity can be really helpful. So either whether it's something that you're doing as a program, or whether you're doing it alongside a coach, a mentor, spiritual advisor, that having somebody there can support you as well, so that you don't get caught up into that whirlwind of negative feeling. And thinking I can't do anything right. So we want to boot people out of that pattern of thinking and start to think about the future, start to be future oriented, and to evaluate our experiences so we can think through what can we do differently next time.
Which is part of the learning process in general, right?
Absolutely.
So let's work through the strategies. I'm going to get Mark to come back on the in a moment. Your strategies, you talk about the first strategy being self-awareness, reflection, self-awareness. Right?
Yeah.
I'll get Kirsty, I'll get you to describe it a little bit, and then we'll get Mark to interact and talk about strategies that he
Sure. Look, in terms of where I'm going with this program of reflection, we think about it, and this is all of the team of work that we're doing at Macquarie University as well. So we're thinking about helping people to reflect in 3 key areas. So we think about people who are becoming self-aware. Then we want people to grow in their evaluation of how they assess themselves, and then to move forward into the development phase. What can they do next? So in the first phase, in that self-awareness phase, we really want people to, well, what we're getting people to do is to think about a stressful or difficult experience that they've had and to write about it. Okay? And as they're writing about it, we get them to follow a protocol of questions that follow these 3 processes.
And why write? What's the writing piece do?
Well, we're still understanding that.
Yeah.
We don't exactly know how it works, but what we think it is that it's creating meaning. That as we create words, as we create sentences and paragraphs of information, it makes sense of our world around us. And so the recent work that I've been doing has shown that reflective writing is better for our mental health than just writing per se.
Yes,
so if you're journaling, that can be a good thing, because writing has been shown to be effective. It is good, but it's even better if you're doing this reflection in a structured process as well. Yeah.
I mean, I had always learned as a trainer, writing rather than typing is better pedagogy.
Yes.
It goes in better.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, Mark, do you want to comment on self-awareness?
I just affirm how important everything Christy and you have been talking about is, what you're not aware of, you can't deal with. So self-awareness is so important, as is the reflection. I heard someone phrase it: experience isn't the greatest teacher. We actually have new experiences every day. It's only experience that you reflect on that can become insight. And so one of the things that was helpful in me seeing an external mentor like Keith Farmer is he was actually asking me, how's your energy tank today? How's your emotional tank? And so it forced me to reflect and to articulate what my experience was and where I was. We tend to read our physical gauges pretty well. We know when we're hungry or we haven't slept. We read our spiritual gauges pretty well. That emotional space is a lot more subjective. And so particularly if you're an activistic leader, achievement leader, we can be so busy doing that we don't really give attention to our emotional tank, sometimes until it's running on empty. And so you mentioned journaling, Christy and Kirsty. I journal regularly, and one of the regular questions I ask myself is, how do I feel? And just having to stop and go, yeah, how am I feeling right now, helps to create awareness. Sometimes when I'm coaching pastors, I get them to draw a list of, over the last week or month, tell me when I felt energized when, and I felt drained when. So you reflect on what's energizing you right now, what's draining you. Or another way to look at it is, we all have a fulfillment and a frustration gauge, and they're always moving in ministry. But if your frustration gauge is higher than your fulfillment gauge over a long period of time, then that's that warning light. As we say, the red light on your dashboard is your friend. Don't smash it with a hammer, and I rebuke you in Jesus' name. No, your emotions are signals that something underneath the hood, as it were, needs attention. So yeah, we just affirm everything that we're talking about. It starts with awareness. How is your emotional world? Reflect on what's happening there. Externalizing, talking about it, journaling, meeting with someone outside your world. Because if we don't give attention to it, once that gets pretty, if you're on a quarter of a tank, you've got options. But once you get on empty, you're not going anywhere. So it's such an important area to be aware of.
Thank you, mate. I just want to say we've got about 30 ministry partners working for Partners in Ministry around Australia, and now they all know that when we ask that question, how's your energy tank, 1 to 10, we copied it from Keith Farmer. Keith, we're really proud to have Keith as part of our team now. If you want to see Keith on video, there's a wonderful video on our website. It's called the Mentoring Series, and 4-part investigation or interview by Lee Hatcher of Keith, really worthwhile looking. But Kirsty, you were telling me beforehand that self-reflection, self-awareness helps me to, as Mark said, understand my triggers, understand the impact of my triggers. Then we can move on to the next part, which is evaluation.
Yeah. So once we've done that piece of self-evaluation, so we've become aware of those triggers, so once we've put a couple of those different perhaps journals or sessions together with a coach, what are the sorts of things that I'm typically being stressed by? What are the triggers that I'm engaging in? So what are the insights that we can gain from that self-awareness piece? Then we can take that into evaluation. So thinking about a specific activity or event that has been difficult or demanding for me, how do I evaluate that? And for each of us, it's going to be quite different. Like, how do I determine whether or not I'm happy with that behaviour or that response to that stressful situation?
What a good question.
I can't tell you how to feel about a particular instance. And if I found it stressful, what would I count as a successful outcome in dealing with that stressful event? So how do I evaluate it? And so what we get people to do is, before we start on this reflective activity, we ask people to identify what their values are.
This is deep value stuff, isn't it?
This is deep value stuff. And what we find is that as people then use their own set of values to determine whether or not their behaviours, their actions have been effective or successful or not, that can be a real eye-opener for them to understand their stressors even more. Because they can see, actually, I did behave according to my values, And I'm actually really satisfied with my response, even though the outcome wasn't the outcome that I had hoped for or prayed for. I've lived out my values.
Which is a positive improvement. It's a positive
and it's
reflection.
a good insight to come to. And I think as Christian people as well, if we get into the situation where we're evaluating ourselves and we go, actually, I didn't live out my values. As Christian people, we're used to, we know that we're going to get to that point. We're not always going to live out our values. And so at that point, we can actually rest on God's forgiveness, turn to Him for forgiveness, and be thankful to Him for calling us into His family and for recognising us as His people.
Yeah.
And so even then, when we haven't lived out our values, that evaluation piece can be really beneficial for us.
Thank you, Kirsty. Mark, do you want to make any comment about that?
Look, I think what comes to mind is just the need for time to do these types of things. If you're going to reflect, if you're going to evaluate, you have to stop. You know, when our kids were young, we used to often drive from Melbourne all the way up to Queensland. And it's a long trip when you just get out of the city and one of them says, "Can we see Queensland yet?" And on those long trips, one of the things you hate to do is stop for petrol. Because when I stop and I'm filling up, all those slow, semi-trailers and caravans that I've been passing are now passing me. It's so annoying, and I wish there was a way to fill up with petrol without stopping. But if you don't fill up, you're not going to make the distance. And I think ministry, it's never done. It's just relentless. It keeps coming at you, and so if you're waiting for things to stop, you won't give attention to your inner world. And so, I think it's the clock versus the compass. We tend to live our life by the clock, which is speed. The compass is direction, and I think we need a daily, weekly, monthly, almost an appointment with ourselves where we just stop and pull out the compass and go, it's not about how fast I'm going, but you mentioned the word values there, Kirsty. Am I being the person I want to be? Am I heading the direction I want to go? To change the metaphor, if you've got a bucket of muddy water, you can kind of just keep splashing the water, it'll stay muddy. But if you'll be still, if you'll have some solitude and just wait, eventually all the debris falls to the bottom, you get some clarity. And so I think there needs to be some investment of time, the beauty of the pause, and actually being still. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to do these things. You can't really do all this on the run and at high speed.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you so much. Reflection, by the way, you remind me, Mark, when we train people in time management, influenced by Kirsty, we always train people that where is your reflection in your day? Are you going to finish the day and give thanks to God for what's happened? Are you going to think about how good today was? Are you going to think about the week, the end of the week, how did the week go? And then looking ahead to next week. Reflection is such a core tool. But you've talked about the quality of reflection now. The third piece after self-awareness, evaluation,
is development. So once we've spent this time thinking about these difficult situations, we want to be thinking about how do we use those resilient capacities in the future. So this is the future-oriented piece, and this is how we don't want to get stuck in rumination. We want to be thinking for the future. And so we'll be thinking about resources, we're thinking about strategies or emotion regulation strategies that we're using in the moment. We're thinking about the beliefs that we've had that have influenced us in the past and that we've evaluated either positively or negatively or somewhere in between, and thinking through what am I going to do if I'm in a similar situation again next time. So if I've had a really tough time with this particular situation, what can I learn from that? And so what we want people to do when they're reflecting is to learn what are some great new resilient capacities that they can use around that particular stressor, so that they can move from it being a bounce back type resilience so that they can turn it into robust resilience. So I might have gotten through that this time around and I've got some good resources to support me. What were the strategies that I used in that particular moment? Did I use humour, or did I plan for it, or did I go out for a walk to consider, did I ask for time out to think about that particular situation? What was it that worked well and that I might be able to use again in the future if I'm in a similar situation? But equally, where else can I draw resources to deal with those sorts of situations? So have I seen somebody else, have I seen Mark perform particularly well in a stressful situation very similar to that? What did he do? What can I draw into my repertoire of resilient capacities that help me get through that next time? So that when I'm in the moment next time and I'm being self-aware in the moment, on the moment, I'm self-aware and I go, oh, this is one of those stressful situations. What did I decide I was going to try again? What was that? Okay, I know I've got some techniques that I want to try out next time. This is it. Let's give it a go. And we want to broaden people's resilient capacities, the repertoire of strategies that they use, so that as that repertoire is broadened, they're not stuck in the same old patterns that may or may not work. They're trying new things. They're learning to be resilient.
And that's going to take intentionality. And I take it like anything, a habit only forms after practice.
Yeah.
So this is why it's hard work. The other thing I'm reminded as you say that is we're reminded in the New Testament clearly that God gifted us a body. And you said, ask Mark what he did. That's where the power of... I know ministers are isolated, like it's really hard to be vulnerable to the flock. But that's where having someone like Mark come and walk beside you, having a coach, a mentor, a pastoral supervisor, hey, what do you do? Yeah. Or ministers getting together, peer coaching.
Or even if it's just somebody who you admire, it may not necessarily even be somebody within the ministry. It might be somebody who is in your congregation who you know has some skills in a particular area. How to manage an elders meeting, or just those sorts of things as well.
I'll just keep going to Mark because he's done so much. Mark, what do you think?
A couple of thoughts on development that might be helpful today. I heard someone share that it's good to sometimes evaluate the season we're in, and there's kind of three zones. There's the challenge zone where we're being appropriately challenged. There's the comfort zone where we're under-challenged, and then there's the stress zone when we're being dangerously over-challenged. So, for those listening today, I wonder, are you in the comfort zone? Are you under-challenged? Are you in the challenge zone, appropriately challenged, or dangerously over-challenged? And I guess that stress zone is what we're talking about today. And so when I coach pastors, sometimes when maybe between now and Christmas, it's just overwhelming, I encourage them to do a little bit of triage with some Ds. What can you delete from your plate right now that just doesn't need to be done? What can you delegate to someone else to maybe develop them through empowering them to do it? What can you defer? It just doesn't need to be done this quarter. We can get to that next year. And what can you decide? Some problems are just a decision waiting to happen. So when you're in that stress zone where you're dangerously over-challenged, you've got to act. You've got to reduce the pressure. Otherwise, that's going to cause some issues. Just one other comment, Peter. Actually, a few weekends ago, I preached a sermon from 1 Kings 19. And one of the things I love about the Bible is it doesn't just tell us the stories of victory and overcoming it. It shows us leaders that have low moments, low times, whether it's Moses or Job. And so 1 Kings 19 is Elijah. Elijah is so low, so down that he's actually suicidal. He wants to end it all. And if you look at the context, he's had a huge high. He's had this battle with the prophets of Baal and amazing power of God, fire coming from heaven. And then he runs, and if you look at the kilometers he traveled, he's eventually exhausted, ends up in a cave. And I really admire how God comes along and pastorally brings Elijah through this episode of depression, really, as well as burnout. Firstly, he looks after his physical health. It's interesting, an angel comes and just lets him sleep. He's exhausted. And then the angel cooks up some food for him. I think this is the origin of angel food cake from my theory. But you'll notice the first thing God does is just let him sleep, and he feeds him. And, when you're burned out, you've got to look after your physical well-being. Kirsty mentioned that physical tank. Next, he gets Elijah to look at his thinking. He actually asks him a question. Hey, Elijah, what are you doing here? And as you know, when God asks a question, he's not looking for information. He's wanting you to think about what's going on? It's interesting. Elijah's so discouraged. He doesn't think his ministry is effective. In fact, he says, I'm the only one left. What's amazing, a little later, God says, hey, Elijah, I've actually got 7,000 who haven't bowed the knee to Baal. Elijah's thinking was out 7,000 to 1. And when you're burnt out and you're low, there's a distortion to our thinking. There's a whole study on pessimism and optimism. Martin Seligman, in his excellent book, Learned Optimism, talks about it's not so much what's happening to us, but the way we're explaining what's happening. And that's a whole subject. Then he gives Elijah just a few tasks. He says, I want you to go, there's 2 kings to anoint, and you need to appoint an assistant. And, when you're really down, you got to just take some baby steps. He didn't give him 20 things. He just gave him 3 simple tasks. Just lower your expectations about what you could do in a day. And then the final point was Elijah was alone in that cave. He actually left his assistant and he came to the cave alone. And that third task was go and appoint an assistant, Elisha. And so I'd say, don't go it alone. Ministry can be lonely, but I think part of the solitude for Elijah here actually didn't help his experience with burnout. And so he ended up appointing Elisha as an assistant. As you know, he recovered from this burnout, emotional exhaustion time, and he went on and his ministry continued, and he had some great days ahead. So anyway, without doing a Bible study, Peter, I think 1 Kings 19 has some really interesting insight for how God helped this amazingly powerful leader. It's not a sign of weakness that you feel like you're burning out or maybe feeling low. Even great leaders have some low times, and I just love the way God comes alongside Elijah and cares for him and helps to refuel him for his next season.
I'm reminded, Mark, there may be people on this call who are feeling down at the moment, feeling low, short of energy. We're praying for you. That's what we do at Partners in Ministry. We pray for people we work with and who we don't work with. But also, there are places to go. The first place I would go is the Scriptures. You remind me, the Scriptures acknowledge that grief is real. I just read Lamentations this week. And yet in the middle of Lamentations is hope. But the Scriptures show us there's a time under the sun. There's a season for everything. But if you need help, we're not clinical psychologists, so we'd encourage you to reach out for someone who could support you. There's Beyond Blue website. There's the Lifeline website if you need quick help. And then there are other people who could support. We at Partners in Ministry, though, would love to walk beside anyone who would like us to walk beside them. What Mark just said is something we do. We want to walk beside people and help them, both personally and professionally, that they might flourish in ministry. There's a question there I think we should address, which is a question. We've only got time for a couple of questions, but this issue of resources, what do you both reckon are the key resources that are available to a leader of a church? I can't be vulnerable to many people in the church. I'm isolated. My family are impacted because people go to them. What are the resources I have? Kirsty, you've talked about methods. What are the other resources that I have available to me?
I'd be interested to understand sort of the specific nature of the sorts of resources that we're thinking about here, because so I mentioned 6 different tanks that we want to fill up. So I think in ministry we really want to make sure we've got our spiritual resources constantly being refilled. And so from that perspective, we've already spoken now about making sure we go back into the Scriptures, that we spend time in God's word, but also ensuring that we have other people around us who can build us up as well. So it is difficult in a ministry environment, and we're starting to think there about our social resources as well, and who's in our social, who's in our support truck if we're riding a bike, who's in the support truck. So there might be people who are in your congregation, who are in your support truck, but equally I'd encourage people to think about having people who are on the outside of their ministry, who have your back. So that might be a coach, that might be old friends, and being intentional about spending time and getting in touch with people who have known you in ministry for a length of time. So you can build those social resources as well, and that they're there to support you when you're in tough times.
And I'm hearing you say, and Mark, you alluded to this, someone or people who will speak seriously into these 6 areas, rather than just how you're going.
Yeah.
It's how you're going and next level in. What do you mean by that?
And what are you doing about
that's
that?
right.
How's that making you feel? What's the impact of that on your family?
Yeah. Mark, do you have anything to add to that?
Just to affirm what Kirsty said, I think your constellation of relationships is so very important. You know, in a church environment, most people, if you're the leader or the pastor, they want something from you. So they're emotionally draining. They're not bad, that's not negative, but they need something from you. We all need emotionally replenishing people that we get with that don't need something from us. And so sometimes that can happen within the church, but sometimes it's outside of the church in a formal relationship, as Peter said, a coach or a mentor, but just friendships from people maybe outside of your immediate world that don't look at you as the pastor and leader, but look at you just as a human, as an individual. I think fun's another thing too. You know, I think joy is such an important quality, and so sometimes just having a hobby, you know, doing something outside of ministry, we can just be so engrossed with the work of the church. And so whether it's a sport or a hobby or something you're doing on the side, sometimes it just gives you an escape, as it were, from the burden of ministry. And you find when you kind of come back to it, you feel a little bit refueled. So I'd encourage that too.
And that's a helpful point as well, because when we're thinking about the resources, you can get stuck into thinking, okay, I've got to fill this tank and this tank and this tank.
Yeah.
Sometimes you can fill 2 different tanks with the one activity.
Oh.
So if you join a sports team, you might be supporting your physical health, and you might also be building up your social and emotional resources there as well.
We've had a comment there. Cricket at 49 still working for me.
Excellent. Yeah,
Well,
I
that's
like
good.
cricket.
Well,
Very
I
good.
watch cricket too, but I think you're talking about playing. Well done.
Yeah, well, I'm up for the netball when we don't lose.
Well, we've got New Zealanders on the call, so congratulations
Well
to
done
New Zealand for
to you,
beating
New
Australia this week. Friends, thank you so much for joining us. I hope this has been helpful for you. We've put a survey in the chat because we'd love to hear your feedback. We want to work out whether this is of value to you and whether what we should cover in the future. So our next webinar is in November. It's going to be building a healthy and effective team. Craig Bailey, who's got a history in leadership development, and Cheryl McCallum, who's also got a history in leadership development, are going to lead that series. We'll send you an invitation soon. But please do download the short survey in the chat, because we'd love to hear from you as to what you liked, what was helpful, and what we could do differently or better for you next time. I also want to say, look, we'd love to support you. We love the church, and we recognise the importance of church leaders. We love church leaders. Partners in Ministry exists to support leaders and to help leaders to flourish, because we want to see Christ's church flourish. Please check us out at www.partnersinministry.com. Please send us an email at info@partnersinministry.com. And if you've got a personal question that you'd like to address to us, or specifically to Mark or to Kirsty, please also send that to info@partnersinministry.com, and we'll forward that. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really, really appreciate it. I want to thank Kirsty and Mark, and we'd love to hear more from you. May God bless you richly. Thanks for joining us today.